Hello everyone, welcome to this podcast about our special report on POSAI. Let's start off by travelling to a far-flung exotic location, farming bananas on a volcanic island, or producing milk thousands of kilometres from the European mainland, or growing tomatoes while competing with producers halfway across the globe. Sound challenging? Well, it's an everyday reality for farmers in the EU's outermost regions. My name's Laura Macmillan and I'm a translator here at the European Court of Auditors. Today I'm joined by my colleague Nicholas Edwards, an auditor and assistant to the director in Chamber 1. Hi Nicholas.
Hi Laura, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. And yourself?
I'm fine, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for being here. Together, we're going to be exploring the key findings of our special report on EU agricultural support for the outermost regions, which was published on 26th of January. The report itself focuses on a lesser-known but crucial EU programme called POSAI. POSAI comes from the French acronym Programme d'Option Spécifique à l'Éloignement et à l'Insularité, and this programme exists for one simple reason. Farming far away from Europe's mainland comes at a cost. Now, before we get into the findings themselves, let's take a step back and put it all in context. Nicholas, when we talk about the EU's outermost regions, what are we talking about exactly, and where are they?
Well, these are regions that are very far from mainland Europe, but they are still an integral and full part of the EU, which is to say that they are a full part of the different member states making up the EU. In Spain, we have the Canary Islands in the Atlantic Ocean. In Portugal, the Azores and Madeira, which are also in the Atlantic Ocean. And in France, there's Guadeloupe, Martinique and French Guiana. French Guiana not being an island, the only one that of these outermost regions that is in fact not an island. And that's in the Caribbean. And then you have Réunion and Mayotte, which are in the Indian Ocean. And all of them very far away sometimes from the mainland of the EU. Yeah,
definitely. So we're talking about regions that are pretty much scattered across the globe then.
Yep.
So that kind of geographical distance clearly has consequences, especially for agriculture. So when did the EU decide that these regions needed special support?
Well, that's the point. I mean, because of the geographic challenges that the location of these regions represents, the EU introduced POSAI in the 1990s to help them, to give them some extra support. And the idea was to support local agriculture in these far-flung islands and locations and guarantee a supply of essential products to them. Remoteness, insularity, and reliance on imports makes farming in these areas more costly, but also more vulnerable to a whole range of challenges in these regions that it would be in mainland Europe.
Mm-hmm. And addressing those challenges obviously requires resources. So how big is this support in financial terms?
I think it's quite substantial. POSAI is made up of one programme each for France, Spain, and two small ones for Portugal, for the Azores and Madeira. And the EU gives about 653 million euros per year in total to all these regions. The biggest share goes to sectors that are traditional in these islands, so mainly bananas, sugar and milk production. And the rest of the support goes to a range of other activities and subsidising also the import of essential products to these islands and regions through a mechanism called the Specific Supply Arrangement. And POSAI is also part of the Common Agricultural Policy and can be complemented by other instruments, EU instruments.
Mm-hmm, I see. Thanks for explaining. It gives us a good idea of how POSAI is structured. So, based on your audit, how well does this system actually work in practice?
Overall, we found that POSAI does deliver some meaningful support and it does help certain traditional sectors to remain competitive. However, looking beyond these factors, we did find gaps in what POSAI can do and delivers. So, the programme doesn't address the long-term sustainability of these sectors sufficiently, particularly in terms of the challenges related to climate change adaptation and the resilience that's needed to face these challenges. We also detected weaknesses in how the the import support scheme, so that the scheme to help import essential goods into these islands is monitored, specifically when it comes to ensuring that the benefits of this scheme actually reaches the farmers and the end consumers.
Mm-hmm. Let's unpack that a bit, starting with the traditional sectors, which are the main beneficiaries of POSEI. What did you observe there?
So the traditional sectors, as I mentioned, the bananas, the milk and the sugar production receive really the lion's share of the funding. So more than 400 million of the 650 odd million per year goes to these sectors. And the aim is to strengthen their competitiveness in terms of the production, the quality and the price, so that they can compete on all those factors. And the results were mixed. So POSEI has helped maintain competitiveness for the milk sector in the Azores, for example, but it's not managed to do the same for tomato producers in the Canary Islands or for sugar producers in the French outermost regions, where they've lost market share to some very strong international competitors.
And what about the banana sector?
I never thought I'd say this, but bananas are interesting in this case. They absorb just over 40% of the POSEI budget, so almost 280 million a year. And support helps EU bananas to sell at competitive prices when traded in a wholesale way. So when they enter the market in Europe at the point of entry, so at the port or the airport, whatever, where they land, and at that point they're still green and unripe before they go to the supermarket. The problem is that when they reach our supermarket shelves, these European bananas are much more expensive than bananas from other countries, so typically Africa and Latin America. So this doesn't really benefit European producers. In other words, basically the profit margin is mainly being made by intermediaries and not by the farmers. And banana producers in the POSEI regions often don't receive enough to even cover the cost of production. That's where POSEI has to compensate for, but it's not an ideal situation.
Mm-hmm. That's where it comes into its own. But if traditional sectors are faced with these challenges, I guess diversification becomes absolutely essential. So how does POSEI work when it comes to supporting other agricultural sectors?
Well, about 135 million per year goes to support this diversification, with also co-financing from the member states, Spain, France, and Portugal in each case. And this support has been a lifeline for certain farmers and has helped sustain non-traditional sectors, keeping them alive. But there are still a number of challenges. So, for example, livestock farming is declining in both the French and Spanish outermost regions, and is very difficult to actually help these structure and restructure these sectors and keep them going. Beyond that, our audit also highlighted demographic, environmental and climate threats to the future of agriculture in these regions. So, for example, a great deal of agricultural land is used for permanent crops, notably bananas and sugarcane, but with the corollary that there's no crop diversification or crop rotation. And the result is that soil health and soil quality does suffer and deteriorate. Another example is that these regions are increasingly faced with more extreme weather events like prolonged droughts, storms and cyclones, which all take a toll.
Yes, indeed. We might remember how Cyclone Chido affected Mayotte at the end of 2024, and then just a couple of months later we had Cyclone Garance that hit Réunion.
Exactly. So, despite the increasing regularity of such events, the POSEI programme still does not take sufficient account of the needs to adapt to climate change that they represent increasingly.
Yeah. Okay, but agriculture in these regions isn't just about production, is it? That brings us on to the last part of POSEI, which is to do with import support known to specialists as these specific supply arrangements that you mentioned earlier. This support is intended to reduce the additional import costs linked to the remoteness of the producer regions. So what did your audit reveal there?
Well, import support for these essential products for human consumption does help offset the extra costs linked to the remoteness and the transport costs that are involved in getting the produce to these far-flung places. And it generally doesn't undermine local production. However, we did find weaknesses in the control systems to monitor this program, and it's often unclear whether the financial advantage is actually passed on to the end users in these areas, notably the farmers who have to buy animal feed, or the consumers who are simply buying the food products they need. And we also observed unequal treatment of beneficiaries between regions benefiting from this same program.
Mm-hmm. So you said whether the financial advantage is passed on to end users. Not sure I understood too well what you meant by that. Could you explain that more specifically, perhaps?
Sure. I'll give you an example. Imagine an animal feed processor who imports maize from Europe with this European support scheme to offset the costs. He mixes it with a whole bunch of other elements and produce locally once it's been imported to produce animal feed that he then sells on to local farmers, and they are the end users in this case. But in this case, it's difficult to assess whether the support that this importer has received is actually reflected in the price which is paid by the farmers locally. And it's very difficult to prove then that the European aid has had an effect on the price of the animal feed sold to the farmers, to the end consumer, especially when we found that there were very high profit margins for these products, which was the mixed locally with European goods benefiting from the import subsidies.
Yeah. So if we look at all of this all together, what are the key recommendations from your report?
Well, we call on the European Commission to do three things. One, rethink support for the traditional sectors. Two, push harder for agricultural diversification. And three, strengthen checks to ensure that import support actually benefits the end users.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. That really helps to connect the dots and understand more about what's happening so far away from mainland Europe. And to our listeners, if you'd like to know more about this topic, you'll find our special report called Specific Measures to Support Agriculture in the EU Outermost Regions on the European Court of Auditors website. Thanks for listening.